Good evening, Shabbat Shalom.
And
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Happy Hanukkah.
That's right, Happy Hanukkah. I'm going to get crumbs all over.
Yeah, don't spit on the monitor. Yeah, we started sort of a pre-session discussion that we're just sort of picking up with now, so we figured we'd let everybody in on it.
Yeah, pilpul. Pilpul is the Hebrew word, even modern Hebrew word for pepper, like you shake out of your pepper shaker. And pilpul is also in Yeshiva talk, discussing fine points, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to Ollie, whoever's discussing it, to as one of our dear friends who is now, enjoying his reward. He used to want to separate the pepper from the flea poop, and I am cleaning that up for our audience. So pilpul is the process of separating pepper from flea poop, and of course, that's what you have to do, I guess.
Yeah, it's sort of like on a far grander scale. This is one of the parables of Yeshua, separating the weeds from the wheat. I know in most cases, it's the title given is the wheat and the tares.
Nobody knows what a tear is, except
Yeah.
you get one in your shirt or something. Yeah.
So it's much the same kind of principle. So that's what we were talking about.
So we've solved that problem.
Yeah.
No, we didn't.
No.
But anyway.
Yeah, there's apparently a discussion between Hillel and Shammai as to the way in which we like the Hanukkah. But there are two possibilities as to what that discussion was, and we only sort of stumbled onto that discussion as we started the session tonight, so we didn't really get a chance to verify what is the precise difference. So we'll let you Google that. How's that?
No, I stumbled upon it because
that's right.
Our friends that live in Austin made a thing about one night they're going to light the Hanukkah candles like Shammai, and the next night they're going to light them like Hillel, and they're going to go back and forth. And this is me going, I cannot identify with this deal. Just so can't identify with this at all, really. Sorry. It's not. I'm anymore. This used to shock me, what I'm going to describe. But anymore, it does not shock me. And how little and petty and minor things people get all upset and offended about within Judaism.
And in Christianity.
I'm sure they do, but I haven't heard it much of that lately. Oh, excuse me. I mean, there are certain things that are just not that important to spend time bickering and fighting about. They're just, because if you're spending your time on sifting the pepper from the flea poop in your whole life, and you feel satisfied because you feel that you're doing every little single bit correctly, then I would say to you're probably missing the big stuff that you are supposed to be concentrating on. That's just me and mine.
Pet peeve?
It is a pet peeve of mine. It really is.
And here's an interesting thing. While it's a very Jewish thing to do, it's a very un-Jewish thing to do. Because if you go back to the sources, all the way back to the sages of old, the rabbis who provided us with stuff like Midrash and Talmud, while they had these kinds of arguments, they, in the end, looked at it from a far broader perspective and not so much on the minor details of stuff. And in fact, there's even an underlying principle in the Talmud that says today's decision, or let me sort of flip that just a little bit. Today's minority opinion may be tomorrow's majority opinion. So it always had inherent within it the understanding that as we interacted more and more with the texts and applying them to our situations, the applications could end up being different than what we feel are important for the current situation.
That happens a lot in academic circles. Because a lot of the major questions that scholars deal with, I'm not talking about within their little particular niche of academia, but a lot of questions that scholars deal with are about topics where it's on a pendulum, and depending on when you're living, the pendulum may be way over here.
Yeah.
But then over the course of 20 or 30 years, the pendulum will be over here. And so some of these, we've been discussing since the time of the patriarchs. So that's even before Greek philosophies or Roman philosophers. And so it's always important, I think, at looking on this from our, I hesitate to say it, 40 years of, working in these fields. We're not geniuses at every topic that is known to people, but on certain topics, we are pretty good. And I've noticed how when I first got involved, I was totally a newbie. I was not raised in any of this. So I came to it with a fresh mind and very few prejudices. The pendulum was over here. And now, this many years later, the pendulum is over here. Very interesting. Let me give you an example in case you need an example. In my field of linguistics, so there's that debate between, is it nature or is it nurture? Are you born with it or do you learn it after you are born? So the nature versus nurture. And this is true about learning, education. Are you born with giftedness or can you learn techniques? Or is it a little bit of both? The pendulum tends to swing one way and one side becomes popular and then, a couple decades later it swings the other way. But it's still, the question is still there. So how does that matter in real life? Well, in my field, once again, which is language teaching and learning, we know that there is some mechanism, either a physical mechanism within our brains that enables any child, including people who later on are going to be classified as low IQ, trainable, quote unquote, is what they used to be called. They still learn language. They learn language very well. There are no language classes at your house from ages 1 till 5. You don't sit them down and train them in the grammar of what you're speaking. They just pick it up. They pick it up through your example and then through trying. So it's both sides. It's not just, can't just sit them in front of a program in Spanish. You have to have an interaction within the language, minute to minute, moment by moment. All right. So what happens then to adults? Because adults don't have that, whatever you're calling it. And there are whole academic discussions about what it's called within your brain. And when does it turn off? And so there's more discussion about when it turns off. And that has to do with nature versus nurture, too. But in linguistics terms, within language, your first language, or realizing that a person, a little kid, can be raised in a home where they hear 3 different languages regularly and interact in 3 different languages regularly. And guess what? They'll know 3 different languages and they don't get them roofed up. That probably wouldn't happen with a 50-year-old adult. It just wouldn't. So I could go on with, a lecture, but it just shows you the issues somehow remain basically the same. It's just the point of view or the questions that you ask about the point of view that change over the decades.
Yeah.
Any brilliant things for you to say about that?
No, I think you summarized it very well. But the idea of the pendulum is really an important idea.
Yeah.
What was important in one day and age, and I mean, even in the short span of our own lives, becomes minor and something else becomes major just as the years or as a few decades even pass.
Remember, let's first of all, because I would not pass a test on this. Explain when Hillel and Shammai lived. They were great rabbis in Israel. Explain when they lived.
Oh, okay. To come back to that part of the discussion, they lived in the time of the late Second Temple period. As I recall, I am remembering somewhere around 30 years before Yeshua, Hillel comes on the scene. He lives a long life, if I remember right. Don't hold me to precisely to this, of about 100 years. So that gives you the overlap. And in fact, there are some who have suggested, and some fairly strongly, that when Yeshua interacted in the temple with the religious leaders, given the time period of that interaction, he very likely could have been interacting with Hillel himself. And so Hillel then would have been part of Yeshua's bar mitzvah preparation. So that'll give you at least a feel. Shammai's around the same time period. They were the ones who took over for the last of the pairs that, okay, Ezra.
That means go back.
Yeah.
Go back in time now.
Yeah, we just stepped through a time warp. About the year 450, before the Common Era, Ezra leads the second group of Jewish captives back from Babylon. And along with him is associated what is called the School of Scribes. And the School of Scribes became, in one sense, the forerunner of the later Sanhedrin. And there were 120, and they began to die off, and then their teachings were passed on from pair to pair to pair down through the ages. And I'm trying to remember the name of the last pair, but the last pair then passed it on to Hillel and Shammai. So there is a long-standing tradition that takes back the stuff of Hillel and Shammai all the way back into the time of Ezra. So Hillel and Shammai, just before Yeshua, and overlapping with his life.
Yes, and so even though it's not obvious to those of us who don't know this historical part of intertestamental Judaism, Yeshua tended to agree more with one of those sides, didn't he?
In most every case, you can see that he agrees with Hillel. There are one or two incidents where he agrees with Shammai.
That's just for your edification and enlightenment.
And I might add, that same kind of agreement is carried on throughout Jewish tradition. Hillel has largely been the main voice for where tradition has gone through the history of classical Judaism into our modern age.
Okay, that is good to know. That's good to know. And it also, once again, emphasizes the idea that when we say Yeshua lived during Second Temple Judaism, he was not the Lone Ranger. He was not there, hi, here I am. No, he was part of the entire Jewish community at that point. It's not, I'm new and you should pay attention to me, and I'm not so big on the Jewish stuff, but I'm for the whole, let's not present Yeshua like that, because it's not true. It sounds great to people who are concerned about following the law, but it's not true. Yeshua was an active part of the Jewish people and their religious discussions, just as any other kinds of scholars at that point in history would have been. He's not Jewish free.
Well said.
I was trying to think of a good phrase. He's not neutral and not leading anybody into any religious background. No, he was within Judaism. And that's where so many of his teachings are founded, and he's quoting from the rabbis in so many instances. And to try to separate Yeshua from his religious influences, and they're there, that is to, that's to present a Yeshua that is not
Non-historical.
not accurate at all.
Couple unrelated to each other, but related to what Patrice just said. Reflections or observations. Number one, in the spectrum between Hillel and Shammai, in general, Hillel tended to be a little more flexible than did Shammai. So that's sort of a PS on the Hillel-Shammai discussion. In the Second Temple period, it wasn't just Hillel and Shammai, who were both Pharisees. It wasn't just four different groups of Jewish religious groupings. Some scholars of the Second Temple period said there were as many as 24, perhaps even more groupings, some of who surface very clearly within the texts of the Gospels and Acts, but others who are only tangential, if at all present at all. At all present at all. Okay, that was good Hebrew, but lousy English. Okay, one final reflection on Yeshua against that background. Yeshua, generally speaking, not only lined up with Hillel, but as many people, let me just simply quote the title of the book that I think is an accurate title, Jesus the Pharisee. So people who try to artificially set Yeshua against the Pharisees or the Pharisees against Yeshua get it all wrong. It's totally inaccurate historically.
I was just going to ask if you could, just for a quick answer, do we know where Rav Shaul was in these discussions? Is there more written about that?
Rav Shaul is an interesting case. But before I get to him, and he popped in mind just before you asked that question. I have said and tried to demonstrate in several of the classes that I teach that there is nothing in the teachings of Yeshua that you cannot find in the teachings of the rabbis. And I'll say it again. There is nothing in the teachings of Yeshua that you cannot find in the teachings of the rabbis. The only difference is what he had to say about himself and the claims he made about himself. That's the difference. Now, we move on to Rav Shaul. He says that he personally learned, he was mentored by Gamaliel is the way we often call it. If I remember correctly, grandson of Hillel.
Aha.
Which you would think would make him.
You would think. Maybe not.
Along the lines of Hillel. And to a large degree he was. But in Galatians, chapter 1, somewhere in the teens, if I remember the text correctly, he says not only that he continues to observe the way in which he was raised, but he continues to observe them according to the strictest sect of the Pharisees, which means he may have been taught by Hillel, but it sounds like his observance was very much in line with Shammai. So there may be a spectrum within the life of Rav Shaul. The one thing you can say is he certainly did not set the stuff aside. Galatians 1:14. And in fact, that verse is constructed to be can we get grammatical? Yes.
A little bit.
Technically Shabbat's over, so we can go back to work. So present active participle. That means, number one, it wasn't a past condition that he was talking about when he described himself. Second, it was, therefore, present. It was active, something he was actively involved in. And a participle has the idea of something that's ongoing. So that was the way in which he viewed his life and his practice. All right, did that give us enough of a...
That was a pretty short answer, actually.
Okay.
It was pretty good.
All right, but we got sidetracked from Hanukkah.
We did?
Yeah.
Oh, about the lighting, which
Yeah,
direction are you going to light the candles? You're going to light them right to left. You don't light them left to right.
Okay. But that should set us this one further. We'll use this as a bridge.
Okay.
As Patricia said on numerous occasions, and in fact has done a drosh or two on this, Yeshua celebrated Hanukkah. We know that in John chapter 10, because there he is during the festival of dedication, Hebrew term, Hanukkah, and he's in the temple. Oh, how interesting. Most of the events that are central to Hanukkah relate to the temple. And he gives a Hanukkah sermon, sheep and shepherds. But again, that's another story, but it lets us know that that was very important within his observance as well.
I'm going to mention something I haven't told you yet.
Uh-oh.
So, really, a good friend of ours teaches Bible history at a Christian high school. And she put down on Facebook this week, she was very excited because she actually had a chance, or she made a chance in her classroom to talk all about Hanukkah and its importance and its meaning. And she had her class play the dreidel game, which we're not going to discuss that right now, but we're hoping that you know that there's a game called dreidel. She had these Christian high school students, Baptist high school students.
Quick aside, I happen to be having in front of me the surprising origin of the dreidel. You can find it on myjewishlearning.com.
Go to myjewishlearning.com and look under dreidel. But anyway, so she wrote all about this on Facebook. And I wasn't surprised. But I was happy. And so, because in my experience, Christian schools are not interested in Jewish holidays at all. Not. Public schools asked me to come in several times when my kids were in public schools to talk about Hanukkah, and I had a great time. I always like to do it, and my kids didn't seem too humiliated by it. So there we go. But Christian schools, no, we were having none of that, even though Yeshua, not only did he celebrate Hanukkah, he has a whole Hanukkah sermon in John 10. So I wrote back to a friend, I said, good job. Well, it was important you did that. Good for you. And now, if you'll just reassure me that in the middle of your lessons, that you did say to the students that they can find Yeshua's Hanukkah sermon in John 10, and I'll give you an A+ star. And I put a smiley winky face because I'm not criticizing her. I'm teasing her a little bit.
And we might add, she and her family were one of the original families in Congregational Orthodox, so she should know better.
Well, yes, you would hope that she didn't get so excited about the dreidel game and the fact that these, newbies are learning all about Hanukkah. I don't know, but I didn't tell you this. So there was one reply underneath mine. I mean, a lot of people had replied to her like, good, way to go, good job, we're happy for you, you're such a great teacher, blah, blah, blah. Underneath mine, and I'm not quoting exactly, but it's a guy. He says, I did not look at who he was or his background because you won't want to know either once I tell you what he said. Yes. And that was when they wanted to stone him for making out that he was God. And that was his comment about Yeshua's Hanukkah message. To remind us all that the Jews that were there for the Hanukkah message wanted to stone Yeshua. Thank you so much for excitingly, happily explaining that to everyone. This is why we can't have peace between the church and the synagogue,
And explained out of context and inaccurately.
But other than that, he was really happy for Don. And he thought that what I said supported him. So,
oops.
This is why there's no peace on earth. People want to know, why isn't there peace on earth? Well, let me give you a few thousand examples from real life.
And we'll write a book on it sometime soon, hopefully. And it's part of some of our courses. So that's Yeshua's connection to Hanukkah as an adult. But there's a Yeshua connection to Hanukkah at his birth as well. Now we call this the Festival of Lights. And when we light the Hanukkah, we'll use this little book that we developed called the Lights of Hanukkah. The emphasis is on it being lights, festival of lights, and you often put them in your windows so people on the outside can see them as well. Think with me very briefly, and I do mean very briefly, about the opening parts of several of the Gospels as they talk about the early years, in fact, the birth of Yeshua. Often we call that the Nativity. The stories are, let me put it this way, flooded with light. We remember, of course, the experience of the shepherds, since we just talk about sheep and shepherds. The shepherds in the field, they were minding, I know they were minding their flocks by night, as the text says, but they were minding their own business, literally and figuratively. And all of a sudden they got interrupted because all of a sudden the night sky was, the old term is, ablaze with light.
No, please, it's still
Still okay? Okay. And the angels interacted with them. Light as part of the setting of the Nativity of Yeshua. I hadn't thought about this until literally just this second. Luke chapter 1, that's Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 1, to take it one step further back, starts us with Zechariah in the temple. You know, Zechariah the priest, son of John, who's not a Baptist, but a priest, a Jewish priest, not a Catholic priest. What was he doing? He was fulfilling his function in the temple. What was his function in the temple? An important part of his function in the temple was to take care of the menorah in the temple. So right at the outset of this gospel, first paragraph, lights. When you get to the story in Matthew, what is one of the major stories? Again, chapter 2, after the genealogy, you got these interesting characters from out of the East arriving because they're following what? A light in the sky. And that light was significant to that story. And when you get to John's gospel, his version of the nativity scene is this. It takes us back to creation. And one of the very first things in creation is what? God said, let there be light, and there was light. And those who read John's gospel and see that he starts with Bereshit, or beginning, will think the image will be light there as well. And then he says, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. And he gives light to all those who come into the world. Well, again, that's a Hanukkah imagery, because we've got the 9th candle of Hanukkah. That doesn't represent a day, but it's the lighting candle that lights up all the other ones. So there's a good deal of light shed, and I'm using these phrases intentionally, good deal of light shed on the nativity circumstances, or in other words, the circumstances surrounding the birth of Yeshua the Messiah. And in fact, from a tradition later than what I'm talking about now, you've got this statement that we may have talked about a couple of weeks ago. You got this statement in what's called the Hanukkah Haggadah. And I'd love to pronounce that also, Haggadah, but it's not the way it's spelled. The Hanukkah Haggadah says, the purpose of Hanukkah is to welcome, and I'm quoting, is to welcome the Messiah. Okay, how interesting. And then it goes on to say, peace is the Messiah. Let me tie into that second part of the package there. Peace is the Messiah. We know, according to the prophet Micah, and we reference this in the 4th verse of Lechanodi as we welcome Shabbat. Jesse's son. Jesse's line is David's line. David is what? His grandson? Great grandson.
Jesse?
Yeah, but Jesse was his father.
Yes.
Sorry.
He's the youngest, but he's.
That's right. Okay, so Jesse's dad. Jesse is David's dad. David is Jesse's son. So Jesse's son, the David, and his line, and that hopefully we'll get into this discussion of patterns and those kinds of things before we're done tonight. If not, maybe another time. So Jesse's son, the Bethlehemite, draws near, bringing us restoration. The term is often redemption, but that's or liberation. All of that is involved there. So. Back to Micah chapter 5, not verse 2. Verse 2 says, out of Bethlehem will come forth to me the one who will rule over my people Israel. So that birth in Bethlehem is is predicted there. But then 2 verses later, it says that he will be our peace. So in the birth passage is this peace connection, and in the Hanukkah Haggadah, interestingly enough, they at least reference that, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Because in Judaism, you've got so much stuff floating around in the back of your head. Sometimes you know where the connection is made. Sometimes you just make it normally because it's part of our background. So the purpose of Hanukkah is to welcome the Messiah. Peace is the Messiah. So that's one of several Hanukkah stories. Hanukkah is a time that's filled with stories. If you look in the Messianic Maksor, the holiday siddur that we put together, a couple of the stories related to Hanukkah are there. The story of how Hanukkah took place under the Maccabees, and we reflected on that story when we used the additional paragraph of the Amidah last night and this morning. Then you've got the story, which is a non-favorite of Patrice's, Hannah and her 7 sons.
It's an extremely sad story.
It is a sad story.
And here's what I dislike about the story. You used to make us read the whole story during Shabbat services. Really. It's not a story that you get a blessing.
No, but it is a heroic story about
They're huge.
Yeah, about a woman and each of her sons, who from eldest to youngest refuses to accede to the commands of Antiochus's representatives to effectively forsake Judaism, to in fact commit idolatry. And then what happens is 7 sons die, and eventually the mother is killed as well. Interestingly enough, and I only thought of this about an hour or so ago, that's another story about 8 people. 8 people for the 8 nights of Hanukkah. Anyhow, so that's another story about Hanukkah. Then, of course, there's the story about the lights. So Hanukkah is full of is just a time for retelling stories. And the story of Yeshua, both at his birth and then also at the temple during his public ministry as rabbi, are 2 more, technically, wonderful Hanukkah stories. Now, again, remember, light is key to all this. If Yeshua was born on the first night of Hanukkah, as we have maintained before, then on what day does he go through his circumcision, his Brit Milah? Of course, the 8th day. And what happens on the 8th day? The lights are at their brightest. And when he goes into the temple, what does Shimon say in Luke chapter 2? Yeah, Luke chapter 2, when he sees the baby. God, you've answered my prayers. I've seen this revelation from you. And here's what he says. A light to lighten the nations and the glory of my people Israel. All 8 lights are aglow, and here he comes in and sets the whole place aglow, so to speak. So I guess that's another Hanukkah story.
I get a blessing out of that one. I don't get a blessing
Out of Hanukkah.
out of Hannah and the 7 sons.
Okay. So, stories of Hanukkah, appropriate for tonight, which is the 3rd night of Hanukkah. And since we've now talked about Hanukkah, before we move on to something else, let's light the Hanukkah. So if you've got yours, make it handy. And we're about to light. But reflections on the candles as they are lit. In other words, further stories for Hanukkah or reminders of the story. And since this is the 3rd night, I'm going to read for each of the 3 lights that we'll be lighting. The lights of Hanukkah remind us of the stories, the miracles, and the importance of this wonderful holiday. The first light reminds us of one man, Antiochus, who defied God and tried to destroy God's people. He prohibited the reading of the Torah, the practice of circumcision and kashrut, and the observance of Shabbat. But one man had the courage to stand out against him, a priest named Mattatyahu, who shouted, "Whoever is for God, let them follow me." The second light reminds us of 2 nations, the great empire of Syria and the tiny nation of Israel. The great empire tried to swallow up the tiny nation. But the Jewish people stood strong. Those are words taken from Daniel chapter 11, which also predicts this time, by the way. All right, I just preempted what I was about to read. But the Jewish people stood strong for their God and for their faith, as the prophet Daniel predicted. So they preserved their identity and protected their destiny. In other words, they were able to remain as Jews and stay on the path of what God had in store for them, thus ensuring the survival of the Jewish people, the nation Israel, and God's purpose for the world through them. The third light, the light for tonight, reminds us of the 3 years the temple stood defiled by the abomination of desolation. A statue of Zeus stood there and pigs were sacrificed to it. But God promised through Daniel that the darkness would end soon. And he told his people exactly when the desolation would end and, quote, the light would dawn. So, having now told some more stories about Hanukkah, I will attempt to light a Hanukkah. Please join me. And I think I'm not standing in front of it. Good.
No, not if you stand over there.
Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. Deserving of praise are you, O Lord our God. You're the ruler of the universe who's instructed us to light the Hanukkah lights.
Move that away from it. Is it underneath them?
Let's pull it away, but I will pull it away.
Pull away a little bit more. One or two more inches.
Okay, hopefully nothing will fall on.
There's nothing less festive than your house catching on fire. Okay.
All right. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asa nisim l'avotenu b'yamim ha'em b'zman hazeh. And so we thank you, O Lord our God, for the miracles you performed for our ancestors in days of old at this time. And you light the light of the night first, and then you go back to the, according to Hillel, and you go back to the earlier lights. 3, 2, 1.
Nice. Very nice, dear.
There we go.
So cheerful.
And
It'll be over your shoulder.
it'll be over my shoulder. Yes, you can't see part of it. Good. Hanukkah, as we sort of intimated already, reveals for us something of a Jewish concept of history. And the Jewish concept of history is that it's not circular, but it's cyclical. In other words, there are repeating patterns as you go through, but you're making progress as you go through. If you've ever seen a slinky, pull it out a little and you can see what we're talking about.
If you were an ant crawling on the slinky, you would be going around in circles, yes, but you would be making progress to the other end.
And since the Jewish understanding of history is cyclical, by the way, a quick illustration of that related to the holidays is when you look at the Jewish calendar, and I happen to have covered this in the class 2 nights ago, what you will see is there's a repeating cycle of sevens within the observances God gave to us to celebrate. You've got the 7th day that's special. It's Shabbat. You find the 7th month that's special. 7th month, according to the original calendar spelled out, it's the month of Tishri, in which you have several holidays: Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. You have, after Passover, 7 days of the festival of unleavened bread. 7 weeks after Passover, you have Shavuot. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, but I want you to finish
Okay.
your thought.
The holiday of Sukkot is technically 7 days. Why do we celebrate for 8? Because there's a special holiday that's added to the end of it, simply called the 8th day, Shmini Atzeret. So you see these cycles of 7 going throughout the way, through through the way in which God has set up our calendar to take us throughout history. And then, of course, it's the seventh year is special, the sabbatical year. And after 7 sabbaticals, you have the Jubilee year. So this idea of cycles built within our time and our history are very much there and ready for us. So we just need to observe them in a broader context. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to take it a little bit back
Okay.
to compare the concept between circular
Good.
and linear. Back, remember I told you I came to this as a newbie when I went to college. I didn't know anything. I knew a few religious things, but I was not prejudiced in the sense of I had been indoctrinated with any particular thing. But here's what's interesting. So very early on, at least after I married him, this is the way these ideas of circular and linear were presented back then, back in the 1970s. And I'm sure that came out of probably the whole early 20th century, in the sense that linear in one direction was the perfect way. It was the way we had to believe things went. And one of the reasons why Eastern religions were wrong is because they saw it as a circle. Life is a circle, and you can never get out of the circle. You're stuck in the circle. This, like in The Lion King, where they're singing about the circle of life. Back then, the vast majority of biblical scholars would have said, well, that's bad. That's Eastern religions. You're going to come back as a hoppy toad if you don't live this life. You're just going to go back, and they show that as a circle. Whereas believers, it's to be a line. We're going in a straight line to get to the second coming and the apocalypse. And as with many, many kinds of things, when you pit one side against another side and you say that can't be true, and here's the thing, they're both true. There are circular aspects to the biblical faith. I don't care if you're a Christian, a Jew, a Methobaptirian, who cares? There are circular aspects to the biblical faith. Although Western people might value and might almost honor too much this idea, like engineers, of boom, we're going toward the end point. There are aspects of, we've seen this part of history before. We've seen this part of history before. We've seen this part of history before. Yes, but we're going ahead. So we can't be stuck in a circle. No, but you can be both circular and linear at the same time. What? Well, that's no, you can't. Yes. Slinkies had been around since, I believe, the 40s. DNA strands are both circular and linear. So evidently there is something to this, not just thinking of the engineer's way or the rocket science way of we're going there, but certain things must repeat. And as we observe history, we see repetition, not like identical twins or identical triplets, but there's enough twinning that we recognize it, and we see the circle of life, and that is a thing. And you can go forward through the circle of life. So it's not either or. Once again, it's both and. And these philosophical conundrums, I think, really affect people's acceptance of new ideas.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not just, well, that's all philosophy, who cares? Yeah, but if you're trained to only think in one way, you're just going to poo-poo, or you may just poo-poo the stuff that goes against what you've been taught your whole life. And so once again, I'm going to tell you that the guys, and women didn't think this up because it was a biblical tenet that was taught. So it was guys teaching generations of little engineers. Straight lines, only straight lines, no circular. No, it's both and. And boy, does that solve a lot of questions. because it's both and. And so I just thought I'd point that out. Because that's why when we say cycles, it still fits in with a linear view as we're
Making
headed
progress.
forward toward a purpose, toward an endpoint in a certain, or a climax in a very good way. And after that climax, I guess we're going to get Bible part 2 and see what's going to happen after that. But anyway, I didn't want to interrupt.
No, that's an excellent point, an excellent observation, and very crucial. And it builds onto a question that was submitted to us a number of, actually now months ago.
Shh, don't tell them.
No, I'm not saying who, but.
No, I'm saying when.
No, oh, okay. But let
But
me.
it circled around again and got to us. And
Yeah. What was I going to say? Okay. Back to Hanukkah. There's a Hanukkah, and the events of Hanukkah form the first part of one of these cycles. Maybe more than the first part, but anyhow, in that it provides a pattern for something that's going to take place in the future. Because in Daniel chapter 11, Daniel describes the abomination of desolation, and in very great detail, about 400 years, 350 years, somewhere in that time span before these events, Daniel predicts the events of Hanukkah, Antiochus, what would take place in the temple, and all the rest, and that's where we get the term abomination of desolation. But about 2/3 of the way through Daniel chapter 11, there's a break, and now he's looking forward to the future, to a third temple. And he describes the things that will happen then, and they will be another abomination that causes desolation, or the desolates, or whatever related to the temple. So Hanukkah itself becomes certainly a pattern for something later. You look like you're going to say something.
no, I was just going to sort of ask you a question. So when Daniel was speaking about this abomination that makes desolate, or whatever, however you want to phrase it, you think, was it fulfilled with Judah Maccabee?
First 2/3 of Daniel chapter 11, yes. The last third of Daniel chapter 11, that's for the future.
So we have what happened during the Hanukkah time,
Yeah.
but then we also look forward to more
Of the same kind
of the same kind of thing. And that's
Exactly.
what we're talking about. We're talking
Thank
about
you for clarifying.
circular. No, I was just trying to make some spots in my mind where I went, has that been fulfilled? Yes or no?
In this case,
Yes,
and no.
and yet not yet. And we find this, is it fulfilled now? And you have to answer yes, but not yet.
All right. One further example of that before we actually address the issue of the question, although this provides a context for it. And that is yet another Hanukkah story. Although this happened during the time right after Yeshua's birth, but this was like 2 weeks later, so it's just post-Hanukkah. So close enough to Hanukkah to be a Hanukkah story.
If it's the same,
Same.
3 months, it's good.
Okay. She says it fits. All right. An angel shows up another time to this dude by the name of Joseph, who became Yeshua's adoptive father. And he says, if I might paraphrase, you probably ought to hightail it out of here. And so Joseph goes off into Egypt and then awaits the word of the death of Herod, because Herod was about to kill all the baby boys, or the young boys, in Bethlehem. And then he gets a message that it's okay to return from Egypt to Israel. Matthew says, thus fulfilling the prophecy, out of Egypt have I called my child, or my son. Oh, how cool. But go back to Hosea for the context. It has nothing to do with Yeshua. It has nothing to do with the Messiah. It has to do with God bringing back Israel. And I mean, in this case, Israel, northern kingdom, the proper, bringing back Israel into the land.
And yet that bringing back out of Egypt, I have called my son, also has to do with the Passover,
Yes,
Passover time.
yes. So,
Because in the northern kingdom, they're not coming from Egypt, they're coming from the northern, they're coming from up north.
yes,
But once again, it's all
Thank
this
you.
idea of out of captivity, calling his people out of captivity. So,
yeah, so Passover becomes the pattern for what takes place in Hosea, or what Hosea predicts. And it's according to the pattern then that you find in Matthew chapter 2. Well, according to that pattern, Matthew 2, it is now applied to Yeshua, because just like we came out of Egypt, just as figuratively, Israel was brought back out of captivity, out of her own Egypt, another Egypt, so Yeshua is as well. The pattern is now fulfilled. The cycle is going through again. So, patterns and cycles in history. Now, if you want to.
all right. So, this lovely woman wrote to us and said, I was reading in Judges. Well, there's your first mistake right there. I get to say that because I teach a course in Judges, and nobody reads Judges. That's just nobody. And was struck by how similar the circumstances of Samson's birth are to that of John the Baptizer's. Awesome. An angel appears to an old couple who have been unable to conceive to tell them they will bear a son who will be a Nazarite from birth and will have a miraculous calling from God. Even some of the wording seems familiar. Obviously, the two men, so she's talking about Samson's father and John.
Zechariah.
Is that, yeah, John's father.
Yeah.
You messed me up with the father thing.
Sorry. My father's name was not Zechariah, by the way.
No, it wasn't. Not even close. Obviously, the two men respond very differently to that calling. In other words, it's both announced to both fathers that their son has a special ministry. Yeah, calling.
Mhm.
Just wanted your thoughts on this, if it is intentional, and if so, what conclusions do you think we should draw from the parallel?
First thing that popped into my mind before I let you in, because and literally, it just popped into my mind as she was reading.
This is what happens to us.
There is a word out of heaven, so to speak, to a couple that can't conceive, and they're older in age. What story is that?
I thought that when I was reading it out loud too.
Well, we
do think alike.
Scary. Scary. Yeah, it's
Abraham.
It's Abraham and God speaking to Abraham and Sarah. And it's about a special son who will do special things. Isaac.
Specially blessed.
Specially blessed.
Gifts and talents and position on earth and time.
So there's that story repeated in Samuel's life, Samson's life, and again in John's life.
Was this intentional on the part of the author of Judges? Yes. He was trying to create a link with Abraham. Remember that the whole beginning of the book of Genesis, well, from 15 on, let's put it that way. From 15 on is the story of you, Abraham, are going to have as many descendants as there are stars in the sky or sands on the beach. And at the same time, none of these women except Leah can get pregnant. Every other person in that, they can't get pregnant. So they lived with paradox. They lived in a paradoxical situation that where they believed something was true, but it was not yet true in their lives. And humanly speaking, people sort of despair and give up. And that's the scene we find ourselves in. And I think it's probably reflected in the Samson story too.
Samson's story, and undoubtedly the readers of Luke, and Luke himself being a Jew, yes, Luke was a Jew, knew the story and used that, set his story up against that context so that his readers would also see it. And obviously his readers would have seen it and did see it. This idea of patterns and repeating cycles throughout history. Which, unless you want to say further, brings me full circle back to another Hanukkah story related to patterns and cycles.
Go ahead.
I tell you this story. You tell me who it's about. Young Jewish kid taken away from home. teenager. Starts out in the bottom rung as a captive, ends up as at the very top of the empire that he was in. What story am I repeating? We're telling you. Somebody
Joseph.
unmute your Joseph.
Joseph.
Wrong. I was thinking about Daniel.
Daniel.
And now, if you had said Daniel, what would I have told you?
Wrong. I was thinking about Joseph.
Exactly.
See, he's just a mean person.
But it's clear, and this is not the author's concoction, nor any other's the author's concoction. It's the author's observation that we do have patterns and cycles in the way in which God works out history.
Every time, it's important to realize, and this is one of the things I leave with my classes because it is so ingrained in people, and I want them to think outside the propaganda that's brought them to this point, which is, and I'm sure that was brilliant, but I can't remember where I was going with it.
I think that sounds about
Oh, uniqueness is not that great of a thing.
very good.
Uniqueness in the biblical text, it's not often and it's not great. What? Why? Well, if it's unique, then we know it's true. No, that's how we might be fooled into thinking it's true. But just because something is unique does not make it true and does not make it, I can't use a certain word anymore because that has been taken away. It tops. Uniqueness is not the most valuable thing to make something true. In fact, it should be the least valuable thing if you want to be accurate. If you want to be sure you're accurate, don't look for uniqueness. An alien visiting from Mars would be unique. So therefore, they're the Messiah. No. In order to have a Messiah, it has to fit in with all the thousands of predictions that were already there in the text. That is the opposite of uniqueness. That is, fits in with everything else we got here. So I'm going to keep saying it because, once again, Western culture operates on the assumption that uniqueness is the most important thing to make something true when it couldn't be further from the truth. Because let's talk about unique. Yeshua was so unique, therefore he must have been the Messiah. No. He was unique in about 1.5 things. No. The reason he's a Messiah is because he fits in what was already there and given to the people all down throughout the centuries. Yes.
And now, how does Joseph become a Hanukkah story? Well, the sages of old, the great rabbis of the past, came to understand a twofold concept of the Messiah. Son of David, one who would rule. Son of Joseph, one who would suffer. Why son of Joseph? Because they understood that some of the predictions related to the Messiah involved suffering on the part of the Messiah. And because in Joseph's early life, there was suffering, but he eventually came to rule, but there was suffering. And in fact, in Joseph's life, it was innocent suffering, very important.
The innocent suffer, yes.
Very important as part of the whole package of understanding this concept of the Messiah. And in fact, there's a comment in the Talmud related to Zechariah 12, verses 8 to 10, about the one who was pierced. And the Talmud says, and this is in a tractate or a section about Sukkot, it says concerning the Messiah, this, and I'm quoting, this rather speaks of Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah, son of Joseph, because it says, they will look on him whom they pierced. So that is part of the pattern. And that then becomes part of the Hanukkah story, because the one who is the Messiah after the pattern of Joseph, not that he was genetically related to Joseph, but he's after the pattern of Joseph, he is then the Messiah. And by the way, Matthew reinforces that pattern when he gives you the genealogy of Joseph pointing out that Joseph is the adopted father of
You
Yeshua.
mean Joseph is
That's where I was going to go.
stepfather?
No, gives us the genealogy of Joseph, who becomes the adopted father of Yeshua, and it's pointed out that he's the adopted father in Matthew. But then Yeshua is called what? Son of Joseph. So and even there, it's not his genetic line, it's his adoptive line, but it is also part of this pattern or imagery of the life of Joseph as a framework for the Messiah to come. The other concept of the Messiah found in the writings of the ancient rabbis is, as I said, son of David. Remember our conversation from a little while back? Every Shabbat, we think of Jesse, son of Bethlehemite, who comes, bringing us liberation and redemption. So that too is part of the Hanukkah story too, because that's a reference to his birth. And in Luke, we're told about his genetic connection all the way back to David, this time through his mother. But there is that repeating cycle of the pattern of Yeshua, son of David, which is something that Patrice has done several seminar sessions on. I'm going to let her reflect on just a couple of those.
Yeah, briefly. This phrase, the son of David, occurs several times in the Tanakh and several times in the New Covenant. It denotes, son of David denotes the coming Messiah. And it totally identifies this coming Messiah with David the warrior, David the final, he completed the work that Joshua started. So when Joshua retired from the battlefield, he told each of the 12 tribes that they should clean up their own tribal allotment. But Joshua, because he's old by then, he was leading these battles in the promised land, and he's old because he's from the original generation. So he goes to the center of his tribal allotment, which, because he's from the tribe of, it's really important that you know these people's tribes.
Mhm.
It answers so many questions, and it gives you so much background into what they considered important and what they were good at. Joshua is from, of course, the tribe of Ephraim.
Not Judah.
He's from the tribe of Joseph. What? Yes, but anyway,
Hold on a quick second.
sure.
That makes Joshua, which is another name for Yeshua, the son of Joseph.
But Ephraim was really his grandson. Yeah, except for that chapter, which you may have skipped over, when Jacob is lying on his deathbed and he tells Joseph to bring his two sons, his twin sons, bring them to me. I'm going to bless them. And we've heard about, fathers and sons blessing. Okay. And he brings the two in. And he says, put Ephraim under my right hand and put Manasseh under my left hand. Joseph says, Dad, you got it mixed up. That Manasseh is my oldest and Ephraim is younger. Dad said, I have not gotten anything mixed up, you young whippersnapper. I just added that whippersnapper thing.
Oh, it's in one of the texts.
Okay. And with that act, it's not just a blessing. Jacob says, you are now my sons. He formally adopted the two sons of Joseph as direct sons with him, so that they are now both going to receive part of Jacob's inheritance, just like Reuben, just like Asher, just like the other 12 boys, or the other 10 boys, I guess. So you've got those two boys, and the one who gets the firstborn blessing is, once again, Ephraim. So God does a switcheroo, like he did with, countless other times, where you didn't expect that this younger kid in the family is going to get the top dog on the inheritance train. I just made that up. But anyway, that God loves to do that. And as the youngest person in my family, I like that. John, not so much. He's not too happy about that because he's the oldest. But God does that to shake us up, all of us. Don't expect things just because you think you should have them. God has reasons that we don't understand. And where was I on that? Oh yeah.
David fulfilling what Joshua was starting.
So David, they never completed the job. Joshua left the battles. Whole book of Judges says how they didn't complete the job. They did not get it done. It did not happen. And consequently, God keeps raising up sort of enemy combatants so that they would have to continue fighting. And at certain points, a lot of the tribes get together, but at no point do all of the tribes get together in the book of Judges. So they still don't have it together. The work of the invasion of Canaan and the taking over of the promised land back to the Abrahamic descendants is not accomplished until David does it. David completed the work of Joshua. And it is, I think that phrase is used, if not in the scriptures, it's used because it's commonly understood that that's what he did. And so that's another part of David. But because he did that, plus other things like David did a lot of other things. There was a lot of blood on his hands, it says. And you think that's where the origin of that phrase is, that there was a lot of blood on his hands. So is David perfect? By no means. But David's kingship and his heart for God and his following of God and his understanding of what God wanted, he's exemplary and becomes the perfect king for Israel. And so anybody who's going to call themselves king of Israel needs to have the same qualities that David did. And so in that sense, they would be a true son of David, even though they did not have DNA that went in the same alleles. I think that's the word. Okay. The alleles in your DNA. Is that what you wanted me to talk about?
Give one example in the life of both when David was living.
So the most heart-wrenching picture of this, which many people don't know, because they know about David because they learned some things in Sunday school when they were a kid, and so they only remember Bathsheba. Here's what they remember about David. Yeah, Bathsheba. They all remember that. Number one. And number two, killed Goliath. That's the only thing most people remember about this great man of God. Once again, not perfect. No, none of these people is perfect, but very worthy king. King worthy. Worthy to be one of the best kings because probably his personality type and his goals were in alignment with God's goals. When David's son, Absalom, which literally means my father is king.
Peace.
Peace. My father is peace. Absalom has pluses and minuses in his personality. And finally, he allows the minus parts of his personality to take over. And he decides that dad is old now. And he wants to be king. So since he's his son, that he thinks he can be king if he can get enough people behind it. He has a whole posse there, like in the modern sense of friends his own age that support him. And he decides that he's going to stage a coup in Jerusalem, and dad's going to give up the throne to him because he's his son, and dad's going to leave town, and then he will be in charge. So when David hears about it, because David does hear that's what Avshalom intended, David says, I'm not allowing this. This is not going to happen. He says, I will not allow Jerusalem to become a battleground and allow people within this beloved city that, once again, David founded it. It's his. He says, I am not going to subject my city to this war, this civil war. So I will leave. before my son ever gets here, and I'm just leaving it all to him rather than having the city and his people destroyed. So he packs up what he can take and he leaves the palace. He says goodbye along the way. When you read the story, he says goodbye to individuals along the way, and some of them say, "Can I come with you?" And basically David says, "No, don't follow me. You can't come with me. I have to go. I have to leave the town." And he deals with people along the way, and he goes east out toward the Mount of Olives. That's the direction David goes. Why does he go that way? Because the idea in the Jewish mind, especially back then, was the time when God was really in control of the Jewish people. That time on earth was when we were in the wilderness. When we were in the wilderness, God was our only king. He was in charge. If we go back to that time, we will automatically be in touch with God again because we won't have all the societal problems all around us. So David, like any well-intentioned Jew, down through the centuries that lived in Jerusalem, they have to get away. Where are they going to go? They go to the east to go back to the wilderness, to go back to the desert where God is our king. And on his way, he leaves. As he's leaving, people notice he's going. And he doesn't want anybody to come with him. And they start to cry. They cry because David is leaving the city. He's leaving the city to his son. He doesn't want to see his son to destroy the city. He just says, "I'd rather have the city be intact and be functioning than me being in charge." He gives up willingly to go, even though people around him don't understand. And that, if I didn't tell you it was David, and I just said this guy did this and this and this and this, you would think it was Yeshua. And sure enough, Luke picks up the story of David leaving Jerusalem and puts it as part of the story of Yeshua with the cross leaving, going outside the city walls of Jerusalem. Along the way, people are crying. They can't believe it. They don't know what to do. He chats with individual people along the way, but he says, "No, you can't come with me. I'm doing this by myself. I have to go now." And so the story of Yeshua during that last day of his life, and the story of David on the day when he's trying to avert the civil war in Jerusalem, it's an identical story, really. It's an identical scenario in all cases. And Luke says this, they lined the streets and wept. The people of Jerusalem lined the streets and cried because there was nothing they could do. They could not help in any way. And I think these stories, you've got to know the story from the Tanakh in order to understand that that's what Luke was talking about. It's to our benefit to understand these scenes in the Tanakh in order to understand, especially the Gospels. Especially, we can't understand the Gospels if we don't know really basic Bible stories about key people. This is not an obscure one verse guy. This is, just hundreds of verses about David and his life and his ministry. So highly recommended that we get better attuned. And trust me, everybody's got a Bible. They can pick it up and read it whenever they need to, but they don't. They just don't. And anybody that you listen to, and in Messianic Judaism or in Christian churches, they're not going to talk about David's life very much. No. And that's sad. It's very sad.
Yeah.
We would do much better in a lot of cases if we did.
Let me add one other thing that she mentions when she does this seminar, and there's a lot more that she does to show us the pattern of David fulfilled in the life of Yeshua. And it's from that same scene. David looks back at Jerusalem after he's left Jerusalem, and it says he wept, he cried. And Luke notes for us the last time Yeshua left Jerusalem prior to his execution, he wept over Jerusalem.
And I think in a very real way, Yeshua doing that He's just saying amen to what David felt
Yes,
too.
exactly.
So there's something about the city of Jerusalem. It's not just mystical. There's something that is so valuable in God's mind to it that I hesitate to even talk about it but I think it's there. It is not just because they had poetic feelings. I think they understood Jerusalem in the plan of God, which is probably way more than we even think.
Which just reminded me of yet another thing, and this has to do with geography or topography. God had said concerning the city that eventually became Jerusalem, or was Jerusalem, but eventually got renamed to Jerusalem, that he would put his name there. If you take a topographical view of Jerusalem, you'll find, because of the way it's structured with valleys and ridges, that's in the shape of a shin. Shin for Shaddai.
A shin basically looks like this.
Yeah, looks sort of like a W.
Looks somewhat like a W.
And you will see that on some mezuzahs, but it's the name. So literally God placed his name there. So that illustrates his connection, God's connection with Jerusalem that Patrice was just talking about. If you just do a quick flyover or put your hand on a topographical map, you can feel and see the shin that's there. God's name is there.
Yeah, a disadvantage to us nowadays is because those valleys have been greatly silted in down through the centuries. So it's hard to see those three valleys that form the shin. A lot of them are just
Filled up, yep.
with the refuse of the centuries.
Yeah.
And dirt, mainly dirt, but some junk and dirt and TikTok, and
TikTok.
we didn't talk about Samson yet.
Oh,
We started with Samson. You didn't talk about it.
well, what do you want to say about Samson?
Well, I haven't looked at this in quite a while, but yes, it is true that God comes to this couple. He tells them this special stuff about the son that they are going to have, and obviously, Samson turns out to be a big disappointment, to say the least. Samson is one who allowed the negative things within him to reign over him. So he had all the potential in the world, but he missed the steps on the ladder. If you've ever climbed a ladder, sometimes you misspeak and you can't climb up the ladder any further. And this is what I think turned out with Samson. And so it makes it an even greater tragedy what happened to Samson, because he had it all going for him, and yet it didn't work out. And so I can't even imagine what his parents thought. But yes, it is supposed to be, well, let's put it this way. The Gospels are supposed to be also reflecting on Samson's birth. And remember the stature of what Samson could do. If he put all his effort into doing God stuff rather than doing what he considered clever stuff or fun stuff or interesting stuff. If Samson had put his mind to concentrating on God stuff, phenomenal. I mean, physically, a phenomenal human being. And then if you add the spiritual on top of it, he would have been unstoppable. And they could have used him to be unstoppable, but that's not how Samson worked out.
On the other hand, the end of the story
Of Samson.
Is that he does reemerge as a hero because of his faith in God. And so the story concludes that greater was Samson in his death than he was in his life.
Is Samson one of those that is mentioned in Hebrews 11?
I don't believe so.
I'll look it up.
Not directly.
I'll look it up.
Oh, okay. So anyhow, the story ends in one sense, on a positive note, even though it ends with his death. But through his death, he liberated and rescued Israel, as the judges before him had done.
Yeah, for a few minutes.
Yeah.
I'm being a little sarcastic, but in the book of Judges, what is the whole point of the book of Judges? It tells you easily 3 times. There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Everyone just let the Spirit lead them, whatever. It doesn't work like that. Especially if you're listening to the wrong spirit in your life, like I think Samson basically was. What are you looking at?
I'm also looking at Hebrews 11.
He's looking.
You're right. He's there. She's correct. Verse 32 of chapter 11. I saw it first because it was at the top of my page.
Good. I'm so glad my brain,
Yeah.
when push comes to shove, there's a few things left in there. It's good. It's good. Sometimes there's lots left in there and I can't get it out of my mouth. So.
And here's what's said about him and the others, including three other people from the book of Judges, interestingly enough, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, received promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, and put foreign enemies to flight. I just realized something. This is an indirect, and this will give us truly full circle. This is an indirect reflection on the Maccabees too. Listen to this. Won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign enemies to flight. That's how the verse concludes. The weak defeated the strong is part of what we say during the Amidah portion.
Yes, and I always like to, every time we talk about the Hanukkah story, there's so many things that never get discussed about the Hanukkah story, but with this, it sort of matches in here, or it hooks up in here. The Syrians. So people call them Greeks, but who they were fighting were Syrians. They were Syrians who worshiped the Greek gods. This is not Alexander the Great. This is Syrians who had given up their ancient gods like Baal, etc., and now worship the Greek gods. And they were trying to enforce the worship of Greek gods because it was the modern thing to do. You see how that? Yes, you Jews, you are just so stubborn. You are just so stuck in the past. You need to worship the new brand of God here. This is really great. Yours is not working for you because you haven't been in charge of anything for years. You haven't had a lot of success. So you should turn to the Greek gods because everyone who's modern and who's a thinking person does want to worship the Greek gods. And so we'll be making sure that you all get that opportunity. See how good that sounds. You're going to get the opportunity to worship that new God because we're going to send some soldiers. And they're going to show you how to worship that great new brand of God. See how that sounds awful? And yet sounds just exactly like today's culture. It's crazy. So, yeah. And the Syrians were so rattled by the Jewish failure to just think this was a great idea about these Greek gods. They brought in elephants to help fight. You know the story of Hannibal, the great Greek fighter, and he used elephants against Sparta, I believe, is what the story is, although I'm not an expert on Hannibal. He brought elephants to Israel in order to shock and awe the Jewish people into accepting the soldiers and the armies to enforce the new way of religion that was going to be true. And it's obvious from us in our century that one of the great reasons why the Syrians wanted to do this, it wasn't because they loved the Greek gods, although they may have. It's to consolidate their power. Because if people worship it in the exact same way, that power, it's once again, props up the kingdom. And so, because if you have rebels, they don't prop up the kingdom. So we can't have rebels. We got to get rid of them. And so the more things change, the more they stay the same.
And to that we say, Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
And in its own roundabout way, this has been a night of stories, Hanukkah-related stories, and we're happy you joined us. And yeah, those candles are just about gone.
I enjoyed that. And it's a kind of a review for me because I took your classes. And yes, you do that to me every time with Joseph and Daniel. I always forget Daniel.
Yeah, don't forget Daniel. He has his own story too.
Yeah.
And there's more to that story than I would say 90% of people know.
Yeah, and age, there's a woman who wrote when I was doing childcare of ages and stages. So that concept, that spiraling concept that you develop as you grow up, and so do we as humanity. And if I can be forgiven for saying this, I see the same thing in history, global history.
Yeah.
Here we are in America and we're going through an ages and stages cycle right now. And some people got it. It's amazing. Yeah. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And,
Thank you.
I lit
And then-
my digital menorah. And the little fella, he come and tried to blow out the candles when I did.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Now, we will not be meeting in 2 weeks.
We won't, no, we'll be out of town.
We will be out of town.
We'll be away.
We will be away. Visiting with son and daughter-in-law. But we will be back after the first of the year. So stay tuned. The second Saturday of January. I don't have the date in front of me. It's probably like the 9th, I'm thinking, or pretty close to that. No, yes. Let me think about that. 25th. Yes, because the 1st is a Friday night. So the 9th of January. We'll see you then.
Okay. Shabbat Shalom.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Chag Sameach.
Have
Enjoy
a good trip.
your
And